All right, last time we talked about the 13 colonies, ran down through just a quick summary of the 13 that become the main established colonies. Some others, there are some minor ones that start and get swallowed up. The Pilgrims are an example of that. All right, and then we start into the French and Indian War. Can somebody tell me what Mrs. Dustin did to earn 50 pounds?
She killed Indians and she brought back the scalp, I think it was.
Yeah. Yeah, she scalped the Indians and brought it back. You know, it could be her summer job, hunting Indians and bringing scalps back. All right, so that was one of the wars. I don't want to ask what she was saying. I can tell she was excited about the prospect. Man, I lived in the wrong time. Or Stephanie wants that. We don't pay for scalps anymore. Not even Muslims. Okay. So all right, that was in one of the conflicts prior to the French and Indian War. These are wars between France and England. The fourth one is the French and Indian War. It's the last one. After this, the French are removed from North America. We looked at 3 reasons why this particular war started. Can somebody give me those 3 reasons? Should we make Jacob answer since he wasn't here last class period? No, I don't want to. He would come up with something, and that's even scarier. Yes?
The first reason was fighting over the control of the land.
Okay, do you remember what land in particular?
The northwest area.
Okay, yeah, the Ohio, Mississippi River Valley, that area. Okay.
Second reason was fighting over the fur trade.
Okay.
And the third reason was fishing off the coast of Newfoundland.
Yep. All right. Land, fur, and fishing. Those are the 3 things that this one starts over. They already fought multiple times, so this is kind of, both sides trying to come up with a good excuse to go to war with each other, but try to make it look justified. They weren't necessarily holding back. All right, so we get this war started there. Then we talked about struggle in the Ohio Valley. The initial phase of this war takes place in the Ohio Valley, around Fort, that place. Fort Pitt. We'll go with the name that comes along later. There, a couple things happened that we mentioned. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sends Washington there to say, hey, guys, this is English soil. And they said, okay, thank you, and nothing changes. Then he comes back the following year in 53 with a military force from Virginia and gets defeated. All right, way outnumbered, not even really close as far as the numbers go. Gets defeated and is forced to retreat back. Washington is criticized for this sometimes. Very, very unfair criticism.
Wouldn't Fort Pitt be technically in the land of Pennsylvania, not Virginia? Why did Virginia have Pennsylvania?
Well, that land past the mountains was very loosely claimed by basically everybody. So there was you can see where the lines go. It really didn't go past that point. So, what was I saying? Oh, Washington is defeated. He is criticized for this, but again, a very, very unfair criticism. It's easy, not easy, but I think some people, they take great pains to make our founding fathers look like horrible racist pigs. Okay, they weren't perfect, but that isn't an accurate description. I did want to mention one other thing with this trip that we didn't talk about last time. He goes there, gets defeated. But in this trip, Washington, if not for the first time, definitely was burned into his mind the attitude of the British to the colonial troops. All right, the British looked at the colonial troops with disdain. They were second-class citizens. They obviously weren't as good as the British troops. Looked at them with disdain. All right, and a couple of things happened. I'm just going to mention the types of things that happened on this trip that kind of burned that into his brain. He had 100 British troops with him. He had a total of 400, 100 actually British troops from England. And these guys refused to help. Here they're going through the wilderness, they're cutting trees down, cutting passages through the forest, and these guys felt it was below them to help in this labor. That would get very irritating. It wasn't just one night at college work party where one guy stands around with a shovel talking the whole time, and at the end of the night the shovel's still clean. All right, that gets irritating. But day after day after day, and it wasn't just these guys were pretending like they were busy, never did anything. They just said, no, we're not going to help. We're British soldiers. We don't do this. So the colonial troops are forced to do that type of thing. And then also there's the British officers felt they were superior to any colonial officers. You could have a brand new, lowest ranking level British officer, and somebody had been an officer in the colonial military for a decade, and this new guy felt that he was superior to the colonial guy. Just they were British, they were superior. Didn't matter rank or time in the service. We're going to see that change briefly during the French and Indian War, but just that arrogance and condescending attitude toward the troops here gets shoved in Washington's face multiple times on this trip. And also actually again under Braddock when he gets defeated, just shoved in his face again. So, all right, so that was the first thing there in this struggle in the Ohio River Valley, the Washington's confrontations with the British there around Fort Pitt. Still here with the struggle in the Ohio River Valley is the Albany Plan. This was a plan proposed by Benjamin Franklin. It didn't actually get followed, but it is significant because he was calling for the colonies to unite to confront the French. Wanted them to form a very, what's the right word? Albany, A-L-B-A-N-Y, a very limited central government. Basically, their only authority and power would be to confront foreign things, gather an army to fight the French, that type of thing. But he calls for this thing. It doesn't get followed. The colonies don't like it. The king doesn't like it. Nobody follows it. But we have the first time that these colonies, it's proposed that they unite as one. Now, if you're familiar with much of American history, we know that idea does come up later on, that they unite as one. But here, Franklin throws the idea out first time. So right here, towards the beginning of the French and Indian War, we get that idea floated. Doesn't float very well at this point. All right, the last point here with the struggle in the Ohio River Valley is General Braddock being defeated at Fort Duquesne. I'll do the English butchery of it. General Braddock being defeated. This really is the first official engagement of the war. Washington's trip up with the Virginia militia, that was before really the war started. Technically, this is before the official declaration, but this is really the first real military engagement. This was a British expedition. It wasn't put together by Virginia. This is a British expedition against this fort. The general's name is General Edward Braddock, and he comes along with a force of, I don't think I have it here, a larger force than Washington's. None of the forces out here on the frontier, we're not talking about tens of thousands, we're talking about 1,500 or 2,000 at this point, but significantly larger force than Washington's. Mostly British troops that have come across from England. So we have the established British military, traditional British officer going after Fort Duquesne. Washington comes along. He is an aide to General Braddock, one of his assistants in the camp, doing things for him. If you ever think, well, what in the world would these aides do? Think of General Braddock saying, all right, let's send an order out for this, something tomorrow, and send a copy to every regiment. Without a photocopy machine. That means we need hand copies of all these. So there was lots of that type of thing that these aides did. So all kinds of stuff. So he was right there working with Braddock, one of his assistants, on this trip. And he was rejected. His advice was rejected. Washington had been there. I mean, he had traveled with a military force there. He had been defeated. He knew what was coming. And Braddock just ignored him. I mean, and not just ignored him, actively said, no, I'm not. You're just a colonial. You're from the backwoods. Who are you? So his advice is rejected. The battle takes place on July the 9th of 1754, just outside the fort. Braddock was expecting to march up to the fort and have this great confrontation. The French decided to meet him before he got to the fort. They weren't very nice.
When was that? July 9th?
July the 9th of 54. All right, and here we have the British learned a very painful lesson about at least the way the fighting takes place in America. The British stayed in the open field in their lines and columns, which it's easy to look back and say, what kind of idiots would line up in columns and fight? If you go back before the firearm, right, and even back when there was just muskets that were, literally you would shoot at the side of a barn and hope you hit it. I mean, it was just extremely inaccurate. There were some real advantages to lining up in mass and charging like that. But with a rifle that is accurate, it's suicide. Okay. Anyway, they had not adjusted here to the new weaponry. They line up in the field, all these straight lines to go fight the French and the Indians outside the fort like civilized Europeans. And the French and the Indians hid in all the trees and it was a turkey shoot. I mean, there were British troops who somehow survived this thing that said they never once saw the enemy. They didn't know who to shoot at. They never found them because they didn't come and line up in the field and stand there at 50 yards shooting each other with rifles. That sounds like fun to me. All right, and Braddock gets annihilated here, not even a close fight. Braddock himself gets shot and dies 4 days later. The British troops are routed and just flee in a panic. The one group that prevented this from being a complete disaster was the colonial forces that Braddock had been making fun of all this time. Washington and some of the Virginia troops, when the British panicked and fled, they actually held back the French and the Indians to give them time to let the panic subside and to cool down and actually think a little bit and form back up. But Washington and the Virginians slowed this thing down. Washington himself had 2 horses shot out from underneath him during the fight. And at the end of the fight, there were 4 holes in his coat, not through his coat, but like through his tails and different places. I mean, he was right in the thick of the fight and never got hurt. An American pastor later on said that God had saved him, and here's this quote, in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. So, and looking back, we can see here God sparing Washington definitely. But anyway, the guy, to me, I think it's especially like the guy that was a stupid backwoodsman. Actually, it was him and his forces that performed it all like they should. These great British troops ran like children. The ones who weren't dead ran like children. The other ones just lay down like children. So. Okay, so we had General Braddock there, July the 9th, 1754. Very, very ugly defeat for the British outside the fort. All right, that is the opening movements here in this war. The next part of it is William Pitt becoming the prime minister. We get a new prime minister in here, and he changes some things, and it changes the whole direction of the war. The British eventually win this thing. It's a new prime minister. All right, let me first of all give you some of the things he changed. All right. First thing, and maybe most importantly, he got rid of the old generals, the Braddocks of the world, the generals who refused to adapt to modern weaponry. They are not the only ones to have this problem. Okay, Hiram Maxim. Anybody know that name? Yeah, the Maxim machine gun. He was a Jew. If you ever hear people talk about the Jews being behind everything, yeah, Jew. He invented the machine gun, the first fully automatic machine gun, where you just pull the trigger and it's going to town. He actually thought it would obsolete warfare. He thought, what idiot would continue to fight with these weapons? Right. Well, the idiots continued to fight, and we get World War I out of it when people were trying to use old techniques with these new machine guns and charge across open fields and things like that. It's just insanity. That's where we get the bloodbath of the trenches. They did not adjust their strategy. Towards the end of the war, we started having the first tanks and some things like that become the answer to the machine gun. But anyway, this is not the first time in history where the technology was ahead of the strategies that were used in war. All right, so he got rid of some of the old guys, brings in a wave of new guys who are much more willing to adapt to the circumstances as well as to the weaponry used here in America. Do you want any of the names? Stephanie does. Jacobson, absolutely not. So these are not on the test, but a guy named James Amherst, not James, well, Jeffrey Amherst was brought over. His main job was to capture Fort Louisburg. You familiar with Louisburg? It's way up here at the entrance into the St. Lawrence River. Supposedly an impregnable fort that can never get taken. If you're ever in one of those forts, get out somehow. Okay, you're in the ships that can't sink, forts that can't be taken. Those are very dangerous places to be. That was his initial job there. He had another guy with him, his assistant James Wolfe. You might know his name. He becomes much more famous from Quebec. A guy named Forbes was given charge of clearing out the Ohio River Valley. A guy named Abercrombie was brought over to come up this way. This is from later in history, but come up there. So anyway, the point is, a wave of new generals brought over, typically younger guys, much more willing to adapt to the circumstances. So, all right, so that was one. Another change he made was he began to beef up and supply the colonial troops. Before this point, if Virginia was going to put troops on the field, they took care of everything. Bought their weapons, bought the ammunition, bought their supplies. England started to help pay for that. I mean, England, the Pitt here was saying, well, if we can get them to send a bunch of troops over, that saves us the trouble. All right, so he was encouraging them to supply their troops and began to help pay for it. All right, and one other change that he made is he leveled the playing field with the officers. No longer were the British officers superior to the colonial officers. It was based solely upon the amount of time you held a certain rank. If you'd been a lieutenant, some guy in the college had been a lieutenant for 4 years, and some British guy came in that had been there for 3 years, the colonial guy was the superior officer. So leveled the playing field with the officers. So no longer were the colonial officers automatically just backwoods bumpkins that could not be listened to. They actually, in many cases, became the superior officer. Okay, so here Pitt makes some changes. Now, there's not a long-term change here of British disdain for colonial troops, but there is in the short term here because they needed them for this war. All right, under his leadership, we have these changes. Then we see, I still have this underneath Pitt if you want your notes that way. The war begins to turn. I'm just going to mention a couple of battles that take place, but the British win this war, and it becomes a complete victory for them. I just want to mention two battles. The first one was at Fort Louisburg, Louisbourg, Louisburg. This is on Cape Breton Island. There's a much more famous island in that general area. Some girl with red hair lived. All right, Anne of Green Gables. That general location. Anyway, this was a fort there as you approach Canada from the Atlantic. A very large, very impressive, very difficult to attack fort. But the British and the colonials eventually take this. It was July the 27th, 1758. It was a multi-month operation, where they're staging troops down in the colonies and moving them up there and trenches, and it was not a small operation. But that was taken. 58, yeah. And then the final battle that ends this thing is the Battle of Quebec. That was on September the 13th, 1759. Here, the British commander was General James Wolfe, the guy who was the assistant, the second in command at Louisburg. He is the commander here. And he is his opponent on the British, or the French side. Anybody know the French commander? The guy's about 60. Montcalm, yes. We saying that one right? Oh, well, We learn from the British who disdain other people. You guys are all stupid. It's like trying to roll my R's and pronounce Spanish words correctly. I can't do that either. Sorry. All right, these two guys go at it. The French commander was a very, very good commander. He was about 60, and he's one of those guys that never slowed down. Just if you could think of who was talking in church about their kid? Mr. Schrock, talking about his daughter jumping up and down because it was candy sale. Right? Think about that kind of energy in a 60-year-old man. Just that he was very active all through the Great Lakes region. He would go to the battles. Very, very good commander. So anyway, these two guys go at it there outside of Quebec. Montcalm. Quebec was another very, very difficult place to attack. Montcalm manages to get his troops onto the plain just outside the fort, the Plains of Abraham. Montcalm comes out of the fort to confront him, and we have this battle there outside the fort. Both commanders get killed in the battle, but the British forces win. Montcalm said this as the battle's concluding, and it was obvious he was going to win. He said, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." The French guy said, "Thank God, I shall not live to see Quebec surrendered." Both commanders die. The British win the day. So that Battle of Quebec, that was the final stroke, really. The treaty doesn't come till 63, but that really was the final. The French, their strength was broken from that point. So, all right, Battle of Quebec. Someday, and catch Pastor Damon in a weak moment and convince him to have a military history of the world. And we can just look at all these great battles and draw diagrams, and maybe we can bring some risk men in and set mock battles. And of course, really to understand what's happening, we need to go out and be familiar with the weaponry that they were shooting. So we can, shoot old black powder rifles without earplugs, just so we can really understand what it was like to be in a line of 150 men all shooting at the same time. So I don't want to do that. You guys can go do that. I want to shoot the rifle, but I want to have something on my ears. All right, we get a treaty out of this thing that wraps this all up. It comes along in 63. It's called the Treaty of Paris. There's a couple treaties of Paris, so you have to put a year with this one. The other famous one ends the American War for Independence in 83. So this is Treaty of Paris, 1763. All right, 3 things. Like a good sermon, 3 points. There's no poem, though. So. All right, 3 results of this, 3 main results. These treaties really have all kinds of things, but here's the 3 most significant. First of all, England was given all of Canada and everything east of the Mississippi. All of Canada, everything east of the Mississippi. Everything on the map and more, really. In this entire region out here, the Ohio River Valley that was in question, all of Canada that was a Canadian colony, or a French colony. All of that is turned over. I don't have listed here, but I think it was at this point. Is it at this point that... No, Belize was never French. It was always English. Sorry, thinking wrong. All right, so all of that is given to England. All right, the next thing is New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, and everything west of the Mississippi was given to Spain. We don't want to talk about Spain, but they get involved enough towards the end to be able to claim territory. And then the last part is Florida was given to England. Florida was Spanish. It's given to England. Okay, so basically the Mississippi River becomes the boundary, the western boundary of the colonial area. Canada becomes a British colony. The city of New Orleans being Spanish, today I would love to give it to Spain or somebody else. But it becomes an extremely important harbor, all right? And it controlled the mouth of the Mississippi. So anybody bringing goods down the Mississippi, which by the time of the War for Independence and that era, and shortly thereafter, more than half of your commerce is going out that direction. All right, it becomes a major issue having New Orleans owned by another country. I mean, because of all of just lots of shipping coming in there, and then eventually at one point, what's called the right of deposit is cut off. We can no longer have ocean-going ships come in and unload cargo into warehouses and then load them up onto the river vessels. So that gets taken away. So in time, that not being part of the colonies becomes an issue. But at this point, not that big a deal. Okay, so that's the treaty, the different pieces of land that are partitioned off. So, all right, the last thing with the French Indian War is some other results. These are not part of the treaty, but there's some other things that come out of this, kind of longer term results to deal with. The first one is it placed the colonists more in direct contact with the Indians. Right. Before that, Ohio River Valley was claimed by France and England, and if you wanted to go there and claim some land and build a cabin and clear, start a farm or whatever, you had the Indians who might kill you and scalp you. You also had the French who might kill you and scalp you, right? Or, a Frenchman could come down and claim the same area and say, no, I got this from the Canadian government. There were legal questions as well as the direct physical violence that you faced. Now that's gone. I mean, we still have the Indians there, but the claims by other countries and that question is all gone. So really, in one sense, the floodgates are opened here, and it's much more available for the colonists to move into this area. And that puts them into more direct contact with the Indians. That in time requires more military assistance from England. They're having to have troops over here to help deal with these. So we have that issue out of it. The second issue was England being very much in debt. This was expensive. Any war is expensive. Even wars that Democrats wage are expensive, although they only complain about the Republican wars being expensive. Any war is expensive. So England was very much in debt, and they wanted the colonists to help pay that off. And there really was not so much an issue with the colonists thinking they didn't need to help. All right, the issue comes along with the manner in which which England tries to collect that money. There becomes issues there with the way they are taxed, and I think very legitimate issues there. So we have that issue, England in debt and wanting to try to somehow pay this off. And then the third thing, we see England use something during this war that gets revived during the War for Independence, and they're called writs of assistance. W-R-I-T-S, of assistance. That's a nice, kind of sterile sounding name. I don't even know what that is. Stephanie does, but you think maybe? She's waffling. Get a backbone. Oh wait, sorry. Thomas is awake for the first time all year, I think. He laughed at the joke. Anybody know? Should we let Stephanie stab at it? No, that's something else. Okay. They were very open-ended search warrants. Right? Today, even back at this point, if you wanted a search warrant, if you wanted to go into Michael's locker, his closet, and his lockbox and search things out, the police would have to come with some documentation from a court authorizing them to come in and search and that type of thing. This was just a very blanket thing where the customs agents and others, they just said, yeah, go search wherever you want, in anybody's boat that you want, in anybody's warehouse that you want. Just go look. All right, it'd be like this might happen in time. The president's telling the FBI, you guys can search wherever you want. Don't worry about a search warrant. And give them these pieces of paper saying, we have special permission from the president to just search at random through Chesterton looking for Christians that own guns, because they obviously have been behind so many mass murders throughout all of history or something. Very open-ended, very much against the grain of English law, all right? There was not something typically legal, these open-ended search warrants. So anyway, these get revived and used against the colonists in the War for Independence. So these search warrants are used mostly to try to catch enemy trading vessels from getting goods in, sneaking in war materials and things like that. So these very open-ended search warrants, they get revived and used on the colonists in time. So one little interesting side note, which I know every side note is interesting because you know it's not in my notes, we're on the test. But we have been ingrained as a culture and told by our courts, which if the courts tell you something, for the most part, take the opposite position and you'll more often be right. But the courts and others have told us that the police aren't allowed to search without a search warrant. They stop your car on the side of the street. They can't just go through it all. They can't just enter your house and look. Really, search warrants originally, the idea was that they could search anywhere they wanted to. But if there wasn't a just cause, then you could go after them. They were personally liable if they searched without, and there was no real reason. If they went and got a search warrant, then they were no longer personally liable. You ever see the difference? It wasn't that they weren't allowed to. Just if they broke into your house and they start ripping up your couches and slicing and bashing holes in your wall looking for stuff, and all of a sudden realize, wow, there's nothing here, then those cops were personally liable for the damages, and you could sue them for psychological trauma. There you go. They would believe you. All right. So anyway, the search warrant really just gave them legal protection. All right. So anyway, I'm not saying the next time the police show up, hopefully they don't show up to your house. If they show up to your house without a search warrant, you say, you know what, we're all wrong on this. You really can't come in and search. Use the law as it is and say, no, get away. But that was not the original intent for search warrants, even in our Constitution. That was not the original intent. So, all right, open-ended search warrants, very much against the grain. So now these customs agents and others, they had this legal protection to just go anywhere they wanted to. They could kick in your barn door and search around, and all they had to do is say, oh, we thought you had some military contraband here, we're going to help the French. And there was really no repercussions to them, nothing you could do. That's what these writs of assistance did. So. All right, French and Indian War. Questions there? All right, favorite 50 caliber weapon? Any comments there? Beretta? Some of you are thinking 50 caliber, is that big or small? Well, it depends on what we're talking about. Talking about tank-mounted weaponry, that's pretty small. So, yes.
Do the taxes that England now places on the colonists, doesn't that mean like the Boston Tea Party?
Yes. Yeah, and it was really an issue of how the taxes were issued. Parliament had no right to tax them. If the king had approached this very differently, it would have been very different. But so anyway, they weren't so much arguing that they shouldn't tax them, but that is exactly where it leads. Yeah. No one else cares about a 50 caliber weapon? Stephanie? Favorite? Okay. Some of those old muzzle loaders like they were using back at this point, 0.84 inches in diameter. Just talk about some monstrous pieces of lead flying at you. Today the M16 is 0.223. 4 or 5 times the diameter in some cases of these old rifles. Old muskets.
So what is your favorite 50 caliber?
I'd probably go with the Beretta. I don't know. My favorite, talking about when I could actually purchase if I had the cash, or I don't know, that's different. Oh well. What's that? Yeah, that's a pretty nice weapon. Oh well. Colonial government. Olivia doesn't care about weaponry at all, I can tell. She just looked out the window completely bored. Not really a significant change if you're wondering, but she continued to be bored. So, I'm kidding, Olivia. All right, colonial government. Let's talk about that next. Wouldn't that be great? Next time some guy shows up at a school with a sawed-off shotgun wanting to shoot kids, the principal pulls out a tripod-mounted 50 caliber machine gun, cuts him in half. The media would again say, look, The mass murder was not averted by weapons, by privates. The next crazy guy that was thinking about it, that is going to be in his head, okay? They don't really care about dying, but they want to kill a whole bunch of people before they die. And if they think there is somebody with a... He storms in that end of the building, and we got it set up down here. Sorry if you think I'm crazy, but it would end the violence, okay? Once or twice like that, and all of a sudden, even if we just quit putting up signs, gun-free zones, all right, that would help tremendously. So, all right, colonial government. How does that fit with killing intruders into school buildings? Our government wants us to wait for them to come and kill them. The problem is, in the intervening 8 or 9 minutes, they kill a bunch of kids. That is the issue. And I get irritated even sometimes with our local cops. I've heard them say, I really don't know if we want to have teachers with guns. You want 8 or 9 kids to die? I mean, that's really what they're saying. We'd rather have 8 or 9 kids die than a hassle with training teachers to responsibly carry a firearm. So,
Just use other weapons and then the media will blow up.
other weapons?
Yeah, like toy guns.
I don't know. It's when you got a guy with a gun is the best option. Something bigger than he has. So I don't know. If you ever think, man, I don't know if I'd be safe in our church services. I don't want to know how many weapons are there. Okay, no one has ever been shot accidentally. Don't believe the media that these weapons just go off periodically by themselves. Right? They don't. So, all right, colonial government. First thing I'll talk about is different types of government. There was 3 very broad categories that they fit into. These are not especially significant as we get close to the Revolution, but they're there. There are 3 types of colonies. The first category are called royal colonies. These are ones governed directly by the king. I've got a list here of all of those if you're really strange and want to have that in your notes for some reason. So, see me later. We agree, Matthew, that you're really strange. Royal colonies, that was one. There was quite a few of those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 royal colonies. Okay. The next group were proprietary colonies. Anybody know what a sole proprietorship is? Jacob looked like you knew. Do you know, or you just have an idea? Just one person that owns the business. Your dad would be a sole proprietorship, his business. Okay? Just one person owned a business. These were proprietary. Just one person owned them. Okay? We saw a couple like this, given to William Penn of Pennsylvania, etc. Pennsylvania is probably a good example of this. Just one person owned the colony. There were usually strings from the king about how he governed and what he could and couldn't do, but he basically ran it as he wanted. So proprietary. And then the third category, there's only 2 in this category, were self-governing. There were only 3 proprietary, but there's only 2 self-governing. I think I must have counted wrong with the royal. It must be 7. There's only 12, and I came up with 13. Self-governing. And it's just what it sounds like. There wasn't somebody that had been given the area and starts the colony. The people in the colony itself elected the governor. They elected legislative bodies. Self-governing. So we have those differences, at least in kind of the big structure of how things are run. But when it came time to really the mechanics of how taxation was done and the listening to England, and they're really in the end, the final end of this thing, there's not a whole lot of difference in the groundwork of how this actually affects the citizens there. So anyway, 3 types of colonies. The next thing with the colonial government is that from the very earliest times, there was a precedent of everything being written down. Okay, think of the charters from the king. Think of the Pilgrims. They wrote down the Mayflower Compact, agreeing that they would, when they landed, make a government, but it was written down and everybody signed it. Everything written down in black and white. England has a lot of this type of thing. You can look at the Magna Carta and some of these documents. But they also have a whole lot of things that are just tradition. Well, this is just the way we've always done it. This is the common law. This is even in some of those written documents, it'll say by the representatives or according to the common law. Just this unwritten tradition of how he's always done it. So not always written down. So England has a lot of written down, but in the colonies there's much, much more everything written down. What powers does the governor have? What powers does the legislator have? Etc. Much, much more of that. Much less left open to just tradition and the way we've always done it. So, all right, next thing with the colonies, the government is a little bit about how far the authority of England extended into the colonies. There was a little disagreement here, a big disagreement in time. All right, the basic position in England was that the colonies were underneath the king and Parliament. Felt they were British subjects, subject to the king and subject to Parliament, just as if they had lived in England. All right, does anybody know how the colonial position differed from that? Did they have to listen to the king, Parliament, and the head of the Anglican Church? Or was it the other direction? Were things taken off of the list? Should I sit down and take a nap until somebody wants to answer? Of course. Joseph. Yeah, they felt loyal to the king. They accepted the king. They were British subjects. But they did not recognize Parliament as a legitimate legislative authority for them. Why is that? I mean, come on, this is the British Parliament. Stephanie? No, they were not represented. Okay? They weren't represented in Parliament. It'd be like the South Carolina legislature passing some law taxing citizens in Indiana. And we say, wait a second. We have no say. We're not represented there. You have no right to tax us. Okay? And that was the position of the colonies. We're not represented in Parliament. Therefore, you have no ability to tax us. Their own documents in England say that they can only be taxed by their representatives or by Parliament. That type of phraseology. But their representatives are the only people that can tax them. And they were not extending that here. And the charters said you're going to be treated just like Englishmen in England. And here, very early on, we see this difference. So the colonists were very willing to listen to the king. But it was when, this is not the only issue, but a lot of the issue was when Parliament began to extend legislative control over them that they began to resist and say, no, they have no right to do that. So a little bit here to defend Parliament. They had a very different view of representation than us. We very much tie representing somebody and living in that district. The U.S. senators from Indiana live in Indiana. All right. There was no requirements like that in England. You could be the U.S. senator from Indiana and live in California. It's just whoever the state of Indiana chose. Okay, so they said, in the Parliament's mind, they said, oh, I don't live in the district that I represent, and I represent them, so we can represent you. Okay, to me, I still think there's a fatal error in that thinking for them to say, well, I don't live in the district I represent here in England, so I can represent the colonies just as much as I can represent them. I don't have to actually live there to represent them. There is still one major error there. Can anybody think of what it is?
They have no idea how the people live.
That's true, but there's, even if you don't make the people live in the district that they represent, what did that district do? They picked them, okay, and the colonists never picked anybody, okay. So even some, in the minds of the British, not living in the district wasn't a big deal, and they looked at themselves as we represent the entire British Empire, but nobody else picked anybody. So there's still a fatal flaw in that reasoning. So, all right, British authority. We will continue next time talking more about the colonial government, but that will be next time. You're dismissed.